The For decades, Britain has lived inside a fantasy, an illusion that it remains a great power, a global chess player capable of shaping events far beyond its shores. This illusion survived the loss of empire, the collapse of its industrial base, and the steady erosion of its influence. It survived because London desperately needed it to, in a world where Britain no longer produces, no longer commands, and no longer leads the intelligence services. MI6, above all, became the last refuge of national identity. Intelligence became the substitute for military might. Psychological operations replaced hard power. And by 2022, Britain's political class had become convinced that through manipulation, covert influence, and information warfare, it could drag an entire continent into a confrontation with Russia, that Britain itself had no ability to fight. This fantasy of power was not born in Downing Street. It was born in the culture of MI6, the belief that British intelligence, rather than British strength, could bend history to its will. The service had long crafted stories of geopolitical genius, tales of deception, strategic cunning, and intellectual superiority. But these stories rarely matched reality. Britain was not shaping the world, it was reacting to it. Still, the myth persisted. And when the Ukraine crisis escalated, MI6 saw an opportunity to reclaim relevance by positioning itself as the West's premier interpreter of Russian intentions. Britain framed Russia as a collapsing state, its military as incompetent, its economy as brittle, and its leadership as irrational. These claims were not intelligence assessments. They were political narratives designed to justify escalation. London pushed the idea that Russia could be defeated economically, destabilized internally, and humiliated on the battlefield. It was a story Britain needed to believe because accepting the alternative meant confronting its own irrelevance. And so MI6 became the loudest voice advocating for a maximalist approach, total sanctions, unrestricted military aid to Ukraine, and the insistence that negotiation was tantamount to appeasement. What is remarkable is how quickly Europe adopted Britain's narrative without question. Germany, France, and the EU leadership repeated British talking points almost word for word. European elites treated MI6 assessments as gospel, even when the information contradicted basic strategic logic. They embraced Britain's illusions as their own, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the architect of their strategy was a declining power projecting fantasies rather than delivering facts. The problem with fantasies is that they don't survive first contact with reality. Britain believed genuinely that Russia would collapse within months. It is believed that sanctions would break the Russian economy. It is believed Ukrainian forces, armed with NATO weapons, could defeat a peer adversary. These fantasies drove Europe into a confrontation. It could not win. And as each illusion crumbled, MI6 simply manufactured new ones, claiming Russia was running out of missiles, that its military was demoralized, that Putin was dying, that internal revolt was imminent. None of it was true. But by the time Europe realized the truth, it was too late. Millions of European jobs had been wiped out by energy shocks. Strategic industries collapsed. Governments faced mass protests. And the myth of British strategic genius, carefully curated for decades, stood exposed as a dangerous fiction. Britain did not drag Europe into war because it was strong. It dragged Europe into war because it was weak. Weak nations cling to illusions of grandeur. Weak intelligence services inflate threats to justify their own relevance. Weak political classes mistake their own propaganda for reality. The tragedy is that Europe believed them. Britain revived the ghost of its imperial past, convinced itself that MI6 could engineer a victory over Russia and push the continent into a war it could never win. This was not a strategy. It was a delusion weaponized, and Europe is now paying the price. The story Britain told the world at the start of the Ukraine conflict was simple. MI6 had achieved a historic intelligence breakthrough, according to London. Its services possessed unparalleled insight into Russian plans, Russian weaknesses, and Russian intentions. This narrative became central to the West's justification for escalation. MI6, we were told, had pierced the fog of war. It had predicted every Russian move. It had exposed Moscow's vulnerabilities. It had given Europe the information it needed to win, but the so-called intelligence coup was never real. It was a performance, an elaborate projection designed to mask the fact that British intelligence had misread Russia entirely. MI6's assessments were not grounded in analytic discipline. They were driven by political need. Britain wanted leadership, relevance, and influence. It wanted to drag Europe into confrontation. So it crafted an illusion of insight, and Europe, desperate for certainty in a moment of fear, accepted it. In truth, MI6 failed at every critical juncture. It failed to recognize Russia's military modernization. It failed to understand Russia's industrial depth, its logistical advantages, and its mobilization capacity. It failed to anticipate Russia's ability to adapt under pressure, and perhaps most damning, it failed to grasp that Russia was not operating on Western timelines or Western expectations. MI6 mistook Russian caution for weakness, Russian patience for paralysis, and Russian restraint for incompetence. The result was an intelligence narrative that bore no resemblance to the battlefield realities unfolding in Ukraine. Europe built its strategy on these fabrications. It was genuinely believed that Russia was running out of ammunition, that its economy would collapse in weeks, and that internal revolt was imminent. These were not intelligence conclusions. They were political fantasies fed to European leaders who lacked the expertise to question them. And once Europe committed to this narrative, it became impossible to reverse course without exposing the fraud at its core. MI6's role here was not passive. It actively shaped policy by leaking selective information, exaggerating Russian losses, and promoting assessments designed to keep Europe on the path to escalation. Every setback Ukraine faced was reframed as a temporary stumble. Every Russian advance was dismissed as unsustainable. Every strategic failure by the West was hidden behind layers of psychological operations. It was not analysis. It was manufacturing consent. The intelligence coup that MI6 claimed to orchestrate collapsed the moment Russia shifted to a war of attrition model. Suddenly, the illusions fell apart. the Russian economy remained stable. Its military production surged. Its soldiers adapted, fortified, and advanced. Every core assumption MI6 had fed to European governments proved false. Yet, rather than admit failure, MI6 doubled down, insisting Russia was secretly collapsing. That victory was inevitable, and that the West simply needed to hold the line. This insistence had catastrophic consequences. Europe continued funneling weapons into a conflict it could not shape. It exhausted its ammunition reserves, decimated its industrial capacity, and sacrificed its energy security, all based on assessments that were wrong from the beginning. European leaders believed they were acting on privileged intelligence. In reality, they were acting on British delusions wrapped in the language of expertise. The myth of MI6 brilliance was always a smokescreen. British intelligence did not foresee Russian intentions. It did not understand the Russian military. It did not predict Russia's resilience. Instead, MI6 constructed a narrative that aligned with Britain's political ambitions, not with the truth. The intelligence coup became the cornerstone of Europe's strategy, and Europe never realized it was being led by a service that mistook its own propaganda for analysis. The greatest irony is that MI6's failures did not simply mislead Britain, they misled an entire continent. Europe believed the fraud, Europe acted on it, and Europe is now living with the consequences. Europe's greatest failure in this war was not military, nor economic, nor even diplomatic. It was intellectual. The continent's leaders accepted British intelligence narratives without asking a single hard question. They adopted MI6's fantasies as their own strategic doctrine. They behaved not as sovereign actors responsible for the fate of 500 million people, but as obedient clients repeating whatever illusions London, and by extension, Washington, fed them. This wasn't leadership. It was conformity dressed as statesmanship. Europe's political class has long been conditioned to avoid independent strategic thought. Brussels is a bureaucracy, not a brain. Berlin has been paralyzed by decades of dependence, first on American security guarantees, then on Russian energy. Paris, despite its political theatrics, has lacked strategic will since Charles de Gaulle into this intellectual vacuum. London inserted a narrative tailor-made for a continent desperate to appear united and morally righteous. Russia was weak. The war would be short. Sanctions would be devastating. And Western prestige would be restored through Ukrainian bravery. It was a story Europe wanted to believe. And so it did. The leaders of the European Union, von der Leyen, Borrell, and the rest became the loudest cheerleaders for a strategy they barely understood. They promised victory. They insisted that Ukraine could reclaim every inch of territory. They assured their populations that sanctions would break Russia and that the economic pain Europeans faced was temporary and noble. Their confidence wasn't rooted in analysis. It was rooted in blind faith, faith in MI6's assessments, faith in Washington's ambitions, and faith in their own ability to manage narratives even when they could not manage reality. But leadership demands more than faith. It demands responsibility, and Europe's leaders abandoned that responsibility the moment they surrendered their strategic autonomy to London. They treated British intelligence as the unquestionable truth. They treated dissent as betrayal. They treated their own populations as malleable audiences to be manipulated. The result was catastrophic. Europe set itself on a course toward confrontation without the military capability, uh, industrial depth, or political resilience required to sustain it. Germany is the clearest example. Berlin knew every economist in the country warned that cutting itself off from Russian energy would devastate its industrial base. But instead of confronting reality, the German government clung to MI6's promise that Russia was moments from collapse and that the sacrifice would be brief. Today, German factories are closing. Energy prices have exploded, and the political center is falling apart. This wasn't Russian strategy. It was European suicide executed willingly and blindly. France followed a similar path. Macron talked endlessly about European autonomy. Yet, when the war began, Paris obeyed London scripts. French officials repeated British talking points about Russian weakness, even as their own intelligence agencies quietly warned otherwise. In the end, France substituted symbolism for strategy, announcements for action, and illusions for insight. The smaller European states behaved with even greater recklessness. Poland, the Baltic countries, and the Czech Republic embraced war fever with almost religious fervor, not because they had a plan, but because they had been told they were on the right side of history. It was the same logic that guided Europe into the First World War, moral certainty masking strategic incompetence. Europe followed blindly because it stopped thinking. It stopped questioning. It stopped behaving like a continent with responsibilities, interests, and limits. And once it adopted MI6's fantasies, it abandoned its own capacity for self-correction. Now, as the war moves toward its inevitable conclusion, Europe is awakening to the cost of its blindness, a broken economy, a fractured society, and a geopolitical order slipping from its grasp. But acknowledgement is not enough. A reckoning is coming because the collapse was not caused by Russian tanks. It was caused by European leaders who marched their own continent into a war they never understood. Europe did not collapse on the battlefield. It collapsed at home, quietly, steadily, and predictably as governments pursued a war they could not win while ignoring the basic needs of their own people. When leaders commit national resources to an unwinnable geopolitical project, society pays the price long before the final strategic failure becomes undeniable. That is exactly what has happened across Europe. The war in Ukraine did not merely expose weaknesses, it accelerated fractures that had been widening for years. Energy insecurity, the industrialization, social unrest, mass migration, political extremism, all of it hit Europe at once. And all of it was made worse by the decisions its leaders made in the name of British and American strategy. The first and most devastating blow came from energy policy. Europe deliberately severed itself from the Russian energy lifeline that had powered its industrial economies for decades. This was not a strategic calculation, it was moral theater. European leaders convinced themselves that sacrificing their energy stability was a noble act of resistance. In reality, they were dismantling the foundation of their prosperity. German factories shut down because they could not afford electricity. Italian steel mills went offline. The French households saw heating bills triple. Britain, ironically, the architect of Europe's war policy, faced energy poverty on a scale unseen in the post-war era. A continent built on cheap energy chose instead to buy overpriced American LNG and pretend that this was somehow a victory over Russia. The second blow was deindustrialization. Europe's manufacturing core has been hollowed out. Germany, once the engine of the European economy, has entered what its own analysts now describe as long-term industrial decline. Chemical plants are closing. Automotive production is relocating abroad. The economic model that sustained Europe for half a century has been shattered not by Russian aggression, but by European arrogance. And while the political class tells the public that sacrifice is patriotic, the working class knows the truth. The continent was pushed into economic self-immolation by leaders who followed foreign intelligence fantasies instead of their own national interests. The third blow was the erosion of social stability. Europe's middle class, already strained by inflation, immigration pressures, stagnant wages, and rising living costs, found itself crushed under the additional burden of war-related austerity. Governments poured billions into Ukraine while hospitals went understaffed. Transportation systems deteriorated, and public services declined. Citizens were told to tighten their belts for the good of democracy. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials lived in luxury. European politicians traveled the world making symbolic promises, and British intelligence agencies congratulated themselves for engineering a continent-wide moral crusade. The hypocrisy was obvious. Europeans saw it, and they responded with anger. The results are visible everywhere. Massive protests in Germany, in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Farmers blocking highways. Workers are striking against impossible living costs. Young people are turning to political extremes as centrist parties crumble. Crime rising, homelessness rising, trust in institutions is collapsing. The Europe of 2024 is not the Europe of 2014. The European social contract has been broken. The final blow was psychological. Europeans were told they were fighting for moral purity. Yet the governments that lectured them about values supported corruption in Ukraine, brutality in Israel, and intelligence-driven deception from London. The disconnect between rhetoric and reality created a level of cynicism Europe has not seen since the interwar period. When societies lose trust in their institutions, they begin to unravel. Europe is unraveling. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. Europe was not forced into war. It was led by MI6 narratives, by British delusions of grandeur, by American geopolitical ambitions, and by European leaders too timid to defend their own societies from disaster. The collapse of European society is not the result of Russian strategy. It is the result of Europe abandoning reason, abandoning responsibility, and abandoning the people it was supposed to protect. When a government no longer has a viable strategy, it turns to propaganda. When it can no longer justify its decisions through results, it manufactures narratives to fill the void. And when a continent's political elite realizes it has led its societies into a disaster, it suppresses dissent in the hope that illusion can substitute for judgment. This is precisely what happened across Europe as the consequences of the Ukraine war became impossible to hide. Policy failed. Propaganda took its place. From the first days of the conflict, Europe's leaders relied on propaganda not simply to shape public opinion, But to safeguard their own legitimacy, they needed their populations to believe that sanctions would crush Russia, that Ukrainian victory was inevitable, and that European sacrifice was temporary and morally noble. These claims were not based on evidence. They were based on what political elites wanted their societies to believe. And so governments aligned themselves with British information operations that portrayed Russia as collapsing, Ukraine as heroic, and the West as morally unified. The problem is that reality did not cooperate. Russia did not collapse. Ukraine did not win, and Europe did not remain unified. As each illusion failed, European governments doubled down not on policy, but on control. They censored dissenting voices, pressured media outlets to follow official narratives, and framed any criticism as Russian disinformation, even when it came from their own economists, military officials, or former diplomats. Propaganda became not a tool of communication, but an instrument of political survival. The British role in this process was central. MI6 and its affiliated networks were not merely collecting intelligence, they were shaping the information environment of an entire continent. They fed stories to compliant journalists. They coordinated messaging with political leaders. They created the perception that dissent was dangerous, foreign influenced, or morally suspect. To question the narrative was to side with the enemy. And so Europe's political class, lacking both strategic vision and moral courage, accepted propaganda as a substitute for policy. But propaganda cannot generate industrial capacity. It cannot replace energy resources. It cannot train armies, rebuild economies, or unify fractured societies. It can only delay the moment when governments must confront the consequences of their choices. Europe's leaders used propaganda to purchase time, not to solve problems. And as the war dragged on, the time they bought became increasingly expensive. Economies shrank, public trust collapsed, political polarization intensified, social cohesion broke down, yet the propaganda continued as if words could reverse reality. The most revealing aspect of Europe's propaganda campaign was the way it treated the public. Europeans were not spoken to as citizens capable of adult judgment. They were spoken to as children who needed moral stories and emotional encouragement. Leaders hid the cost of the war, exaggerated its benefits, and lied routinely about the state of Ukraine and the capabilities of Russia. This was not accidental. It was deliberate. European elites believed that transparency would spark revolt, and they were right. The truth was too dangerous, but the truth eventually breaks through. People see empty factories, rising prices, and failing public services. They see political leaders who speak in slogans rather than solutions. They see the gap between official narratives and lived reality widening with every passing month. Propaganda cannot conceal decline forever. It can only postpone the reckoning. Europe is now living through that reckoning. The propaganda has lost its power. The narratives no longer work. Citizens no longer believe their leaders And the political class has no strategy left except to blame foreign influence for failures of their own making. When propaganda replaces policy, collapse becomes inevitable. Europe crossed that threshold the moment it trusted MI6's fantasies more than its own interests, more than its own experts, and more than the needs of its own people. The defining feature of Russia's approach to this war has not been aggression, recklessness, or desperation. The qualities Western propaganda insisted were guiding Moscow. The defining feature has been patience, strategic, disciplined, unshakable patience, while Europe drowned itself in illusions and the United States improvised wildly from crisis to crisis. Russia adhered to a methodical plan shaped by industrial capacity, demographic reality, and a clear understanding of its national interests. And it was this patience, not shock offensives or dramatic breakthroughs, that ultimately shattered the illusion that Europe, guided by British intelligence fantasies, could ever win this war. From the beginning, Russia refused to play the game Europe expected. It did not burn through its reserves in flashy offensives. It did not attempt to occupy all of Ukraine. It did not escalate recklessly when NATO pushed the limits of proxy involvement. Instead, Russia absorbed the early costs, adapted its military structure, mobilized its economy, and allowed time to erode the West's willpower. This was not weakness, it was strategy. Russia understood that European unity was brittle, that Western industry could not sustain a long conflict, and that propaganda-fueled enthusiasm would collapse under the weight of economic reality. Europe, fueled by MI6's illusions, believed Russia was moments away from collapse. Russia believed the opposite, that Europe would collapse first. And Russia was right. Russia's ability to maintain this strategic patience was grounded in two factors, its industrial base and its political stability. While Europe's factories shut down due to energy shortages, Russia's arms production accelerated while European leaders faced protests, collapsing governments, and electoral backlash. Russia's leadership consolidated support while Europe hollowed out its military arsenals, sending equipment to Ukraine. Russia built new stockpiles, trained new units, and expanded its defensive networks. This contrast exposed the central lie at the heart of Europe's war strategy, the belief that willpower could substitute for capability. Europe talked about resilience. Russia practiced it. Europe issued statements. Russia built factories. Europe relied on public relations. Russia relied on logistics. Strategic patience turned the war into a contest of endurance, not ideology, and endurance is where Europe had no chance. As months turned into years, Russia's restraint became more powerful than any offensive. By refusing to give NATO a casus belli, Moscow prevented the West from escalating beyond its limits. By avoiding dramatic provocations, Russia deprived MI6 of the sensational narratives it needed to maintain public support for the war. By choosing not to strike NATO territory, Russia prevented the alliance from masking its own failures under a banner of collective defense. Europe needed Russia to behave irrationally in order to justify its own reckless strategy. When Russia refused to oblige, Europe's narrative machinery began to malfunction. The longer Russia held its discipline, the more obvious Europe's strategic bankruptcy became Then came the most devastating revelation. Russia could produce more ammunition, more drones, more armored vehicles, and more missiles than the entire collective West. That for all of Europe's moralizing and political theater, wars are won by logistics, not speeches. Russia understood this. Europe did not, and so European arsenals emptied while Russia's expanded. European military shrank while Russia mobilized. European morale collapsed while Russia's population absorbed the conflict with grim acceptance. Russia's patience broke Europe not through force, but through contrast. The West expected a short war. Russia prepared for a long one. The West believed propaganda could disguise weakness. Russia allowed reality to expose it. The West imagined that intelligence manipulation could shape outcomes. Russia demonstrated that outcomes are shaped by power, not narratives. By the time Europe realized what had happened, the illusion was already shattered. Russia had won the war of endurance. Europe had lost the war of will, and MI6's fantasies had become the rubble upon which an entire continent's strategic credibility now lies. Europe now stands at the end of an era defined by illusions, by intelligence manipulation, by blind conformity to British and American narratives. What began as a geopolitical confrontation in Ukraine has evolved into a civilizational crisis for Europe itself. The continent that once claimed to be a beacon of democracy, stability, and rational governance now finds itself fractured, exhausted, and adrift. And at the center of this decay lies a truth. European leaders will do anything to avoid admitting they were led into this disaster by MI6's delusions, Washington's ambitions, and their own refusal to think independently. The collapse of Europe is not theoretical. It is happening in real time. Governments are falling, economies are shrinking, societies are burning out. Protests are erupting across capitals. Trust in institutions is evaporating, and the political landscape is shifting in ways Europe has not seen since the 1930 seconds. This is not a temporary disruption. It is a systemic breakdown triggered by a war Europe could never win. Entered for reasons it never fully understood. The first reckoning Europe faces is strategic. The continent must accept that its security policy was built on fantasies. It is believed Britain's intelligence claims that Russia was weak. It believed Washington's assurances that Ukraine could win. It believed its own rhetoric about standing on the right side of history. None of this was grounded in power, capability, or strategic logic. These were myths adopted by leaders who mistook moral posturing for policy and propaganda for intelligence. Now, Europe must rebuild an entire strategic framework from the rubble of its own self-deception. The second reckoning is economic. Europe's prosperity was sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical illusion. Stable energy supplies were replaced with overpriced American exports. Industrial capacity was dismantled. Public budgets were drained to fund a proxy war. Citizens were told to suffer for democracy, while their leaders privately acknowledged that Europe had no path to victory. This economic decline will not be reversed easily. The damage is structural, not cyclical. Rebuilding Europe's industrial base will take decades, if it is even possible. The third reckoning is political. European elites have lost the trust of their populations. They lied about the war. They hid the costs. They demonized dissent. They governed through fear, censorship, and moral grandstanding. And now they face electorates who no longer believe a word. They say the rise of populist movements across the continent is not a passing trend. It is a direct rejection of the political class that led Europe into disaster. The old parties are dying because they defend a system that has already collapsed. But the most profound reckoning is moral. Europe championed itself as the continent of values, the rule of law, human rights, diplomacy, peace. Yet it supported corruption in Ukraine, brutality in Israel, and intelligence manipulation from Britain. It claimed to defend democracy abroad while eroding it at home. The hypocrisy is now visible to everyone. Europe's moral authority has evaporated, not because of Russian aggression, but because of European cowardice. And then there is Britain, the architect of this catastrophe. MI6's era of influence is over. The service that once shaped narratives across the continent now stands exposed as the engine of a geopolitical fraud. Its assessments were wrong. Its manipulation backfired. Its attempt to drag Europe into a confrontation it could not sustain has left Europe broken and Britain isolated. The illusion of British strategic genius, nurtured for decades, has been destroyed by the reality of its own failures. Europe's reckoning will be long and painful. It will involve the collapse of governments, the restructuring of alliances, and the rethinking of an entire worldview. But one truth is already undeniable. Europe marched into a war it could never win because it allowed itself to be led by the fantasies of others. The MI6 era is over. The American era is fading, and Europe must now confront the world as it truly is, or continue its collapse into irrelevance. The war in Ukraine is ending, but Europe's crisis is only beginning